Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session of FlowFuse's webinars. We today are diving into AI, and specifically AI on the factory floor, whether this is something that we consider to be a real value or just a marketing gimmick. So before we get started, I do want to do a few items of housekeeping. Firstly, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know where you're joining from, how this topic is impacting you, and why you're interested in this. Secondly, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send a link when it's available. Please use the Q&A panel for questions just so we don't miss anything. At the end of this webinar, a short survey is going to pop up, so please share your feedback to help us shape future sessions. And finally, as we get started, we're going to launch a poll. So this poll basically lets us know where your org is right now in your AI journey. And, feel free to answer accordingly. This really helps us understand sort of, where you're coming from and where this problem it lives in your life cycle. Let me go ahead and just set the stage a little bit. So AI is obviously everywhere right now. It is literally everywhere, especially in industrial software. It's being positioned as this next big default capability across manufacturing, energy, IoT, SaaS. It's really everywhere. But it's also seeing a lot of integration in everything from toothbrushes to cars, which is kind of wild. So there's lots of companies and teams that are rushing to adopt this technology, but there's, because of that, this harder question that keeps coming up. And that question is AI actually solving real problems, or are we just adding new layers of complexity to already fragile systems? With that in mind, I'd like to go ahead and share just a couple slides with you all so you can sort of see where we're coming from and sort of set the groundwork here. Let me introduce everybody. I'll go ahead and just sort of list them all off one-on-one. First, I'd like to introduce Drew Gotti, who is our Senior Solutions Architect at FlowFuse.
Nice to meet everyone. So I come mainly from the OT background, working all through the ISA 95 stack. So everything motion control, process control, you name it. I've probably touched it or troubleshot it or done it.
Next, we have Ken Lane, who is the co-founder and chief community officer at Neftco. You may also know him as the API evangelist.
Hello there, happy to be here. So yeah, building next generation integrations that are business aligned at Navtico, but still covering the technology, business, and politics of APIs as I've done for the last 15 years at API Evangelist.
Last but not least, we have Michael Palmer, AI Innovator in Residence, which is an awesome job title at the Marysville University of St. Louis.
Thank you for having me. They wouldn't approve my job title of wanting to be called Space Cowboy, so I had to settle for this one. Michael Palmer, working as an educator, training the next generation of technical and AI professionals, but also building solutions on our business side and academic side as well to serve a variety of users.
And you may or may not know me. I'm Christopher Sandoval. I'm a developer relations advocate here at FlowFuse. I've had kind of a wild career across gaming and tech at Amazon, Fandom, that game company. I have also worked pretty heavily in the API and AI space, and I like writing and talking. That is my big thing. So just to lay the groundwork for sort of why I think this is a really important conversation and where I think the sort of core problem is coming from, I want to talk a little bit about the AI adoption cycle. So this is a graphic that I had given at another talk previously about what adoption cycles usually look like. There is sort of the introduction of the technology, then there's this growth stage, then there's this progression into maturity, and then an eventual decline as the technology faces obsolescence and new technology comes out and replaces it, either in terms of iteration of the core technology or as a full replacement. Where this has gotten complicated in the AI side of things is that cycle has been really, really compressed. To give you an understanding of what I say or what I mean when I say that it's been compressed, the AI adoption cycle, we can look at something like Spotify. Spotify took 11 years to get to 100 million users, and Spotify has a really strong value prop, right? It is your iPod, but on the internet. That is like a clear story that everyone can understand. There's not like a lot of hype around that. It takes time to build. Something like OpenAI's ChatGPT, that took 2 months to get to 100 million users. And so you can see there's been this huge, huge compression, not just of the technology sort of cycle, but of the understanding about it, and then necessarily the marketing about it. And I think that is sort of one of my core arguments that we're going to get into today as we talk about this, broader issue, is that the marketing around AI has not necessarily always been aligned with what has been possible. And from that's where a lot of this question is coming from. This question of whether it's actual value or is it just marketing gimmick. Um, and this really has had impacts at every single level. And we're going to get into each of these individually as we go through these questions. But for API development, it has meant that there's, much more implementation of AI heavy APIs before the product has been really clearly defined. For software, there were chat agents for AI that, people who had never even heard of AI suddenly had access to crazy amounts of technology that were never accessible before. That impacts marketing and that impacts adoption. Everything from end user integrations to industry specific. The core problem here is that we have spent a lot of time answering the how instead of the why. So this is what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be talking about the evolution of AI from the API to product to feature set. We'll be talking about the why instead of the how, and what that means for the technology itself. We'll be talking about where AI makes sense today, especially in a factory scenario, but in a general scenario as well. And we'll talk a little bit about where we're headed and how to unlock that value on the floor. All of that being said, I want to start with the first question for our bigger team here. Um, Obviously, AI has become this like cultural juggernaut, and I want to hear from each of you what is your reaction to that process? Is this a typical thing that is normal? Like, is the surge of AI normal in your mind, or is this something that is sort of atypical and special, really, to the AI of it all?
Yeah, I think for me, when we talk about adoption, especially AI, everyone has got a brand new tool and everyone's figuring out what to do with it. And not to mention that most of the things I hear from the OT engineering side for industrial automation, people get ideas that AI is the solution when really they're describing a machine learning tactic and something that they could have done before. They just are labeling it AI. So the terms have gotten more convoluted now.
I tend to agree with Drew's comment there of just kind of looking at a standard process of kind of how you develop things. We've kind of skipped over there's idea and then immediately moving into development and trying to kind of force some square pegs into some round holes. And so we kind of missed that analysis point of like what's already in our current stack, what are we already doing, and then the terminology kind of generalization of what AI now stands for kind of makes things a little bit difficult. So it's really kind of with that proper intent. I will say though that this does rhyme a lot with other trends that we've seen of this is going to be a silver bullet fix for everything. Usually that has extended though much longer than what we saw with blockchain emerging, with Internet of Things emerging. Those were supposed to be fixes for all our problems, but we kind of got through that hype cycle a lot quicker. This one continues to go, and that might be because of the continuous power development that we're seeing, and now the catch up of implementation is coming through. So a little bit of academic hyperbole there for you.
Yeah, second everything I heard. I would say this isn't new. We dealt with it coming out of the cloud. I think the cloud gave us an abstraction for a lot of confusion and a lot of imprecise vocabulary in describing things. For me in the API space, it's always been, the marketing is the least honest, the documentation is the next honest, and then the actual design of the API and what's possible is the most honest. When you're coming at usage base, we just have a whole new paradigm as far as the economics of it, a lot more obfuscation and a lot more room for confusion right now. So I think, and building on what you said, Michael, the IoT, the crypto, I think this is ratcheting up from each of those. And you see the crypto people really being a big part of the hype around agentic and other things. So.
Yeah, and I think you can see the poll results here are quite interesting because I think it mirrors sort of the reality of AI at the corporate level and at the sort of adoption level. The fact is that of the people who have responded to our poll, the bulk amount of people are split between we're actively evaluating or researching and building, and then there's the other side, which is we're exploring ideas, no concrete plans. There does seem to be this pressure that is, hey, AI is the next big thing. Now figure out how to use it, as opposed to the sort of traditional cycle, which is, okay, we have this problem. Now, what tool can we use to fix it? And it is this inversion. There's an interest in the fact that we really have skipped a lot of steps. I think that's sort of the bottom line when I think about it. I compare it sort of to the World Wide Web. So this is going to be a very sort of nerdy way of looking at it. I think we're all aware that there's a difference between World Wide Web and internet. That internet had this sort of architectural background, it had this framework background, there was a technology, people had experience with BBSs, they understood what networking looked like, and then when the World Wide Web came out, it was suddenly like, oh, it's a new evolution of the technology. I understand. It's evolved. I get it. We see the practicality of it. For AI, it felt like we skipped all of those steps and we went directly from this thing is in a sci-fi book to now it is plugging into our HR data or our factory information. And there's a lot of good about that. Like the quick evolution is interesting, but I also want to understand from your all's perspective, do you think that has played into how we react to AI and maybe even did it amplify our reactions when AI wasn't that great?
To jump in, I think to earlier points, like a lot of this has to do with terminology. Like you had mentioned, this is something of sci-fi books, right? So we've had a lot of time to kind of live with these ideas at a broader scale. We've seen the kind of concept of AI in popular culture in a variety of ways, everything from like sidekicks of superheroes to Terminator robots to things that pop out in movies or wherever that they can kind of serve these purposes. So we have kind of like a natural cultural understanding of what this should look like without the knowledge of what actually technically needs to go down, right? I love this idea of Ken, like the honesty of the API, right? Of how does it actually play out and go. So when we look at these things, we do have kind of an innate reality of understanding, but we're kind of at a point where we don't know what we don't know in the mainstream. And so that provides really good hopes and dreams and aspirations of what we can shoot for, but reality eventually comes in once you start stepping off that cliff. We didn't necessarily see these with even something like cloud. We had instances of those, but they were in very select kind of subculture communities, right? You had to be reading like 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 Gibson writing to really kind of understand what the trend was going to be for a lot of these things. So that's really what we're seeing now, I think, is the reality is really starting to catch up because people are now, and this seems to mirror in the poll, exploring these ideas, seeing what actually works, what can actually, and diving kind of elbow deep into the tech at this point, as opposed to a couple of years ago when it was just carte blanche. Hey, this is going to fix all our problems, and then running really fast in that direction.
So I have to ask you all because I think a lot of people are going to be looking at this conversation and thinking, okay, well, AI is just hype. And that is sort of the question that we're trying to answer here. So I'll just ask you all directly. I have my own feelings about it. Do you think that AI has actual value? Is this just fluff, or is this something that is still cooking? If someone, asks you directly, like, is AI worth it? Is it ever going to be worth it? What is your gut instinct?
I I use AI daily. I use all the major ones. But I'm also very anti the current kind of usage of the word AI. I'm a big old school ML user. I think there's a diverse toolbox that doesn't get represented. But for me, everything that I do, I use Claude pretty heavily to generate API artifacts, meaning open APIs, JSON schemas, A2As, MCPs, all the little digital bits that I depend on. I do a lot of generating of that with Claude, automatically and manually. but I have schemas for all of those things. I can validate what I get back from Claude, and that's the only way that I'm able to use it in my world is by wrestling that non-determinism into determinism using what I know and my expertise. And those schemas are maintained and curated by me.
Well, I've really found it as like there's the be all end all of this is, AGI, us living with robots. I've seen like the real value, kind of like Ken is articulating, is it's a focused approach, right? Of I usually use the term of it looks at what the mundane is and shifts the kind of role of what the human is to very valuable human skills, verification, determinism, like focusing and pointing it. I am very prone to like analogies. So I always look at it as my grandma always referred to me as nuclear energy, right? Used properly, you can power a city or propel a submarine. Most of the time I just went boom. But in this instance, you can see it in a very focused approach. It can have a lot of good benefits. I don't believe in the kind of Skynet Terminator scenarios of AI. I believe those are kind of things of pipe dreams, but or pipe nightmares. But when we look at it in a very focused approach of like, what is the work that we're still doing that is heavily mundane, does not bring a lot of benefit to the human experience in their work, what are those things? And what technology is out there in ML or AI space that can really be leveraged effectively to it? I think that that's even bringing in some of those conversations down to older technology that's existed that has served that same purpose. So I think in that very focused approach, it works, and it also solves kind of like some larger problems when it's structured that way when it comes to kind of data privacy and security issues and hallucinations and validity when it comes to generative AI. I can see a lot of benefit going forward and a lot of stuff helping to continue to grow what the benefits can be over time with in that approach to it.
I think for me, for when it comes to AI in the OT space and value, so if it's reducing downtime and speeding up troubleshooting, can definitely see it. And there's definitely paths to make it there. I think for the OT engineering side, manufacturing, people don't realize how far it is behind already. So, uh, getting to play around with APIs, uh, even in the OT space, is the kind of leading edge, which is sad to hear, considering how far it's adopted in the consumer market and the rest of the space up the stack. So it's kind of wild, wild west programming in those lands. So creating, defined structures that AI can understand, there's a lot of work to be done there to really get it to be of major value on the plant floor, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think we've echoed this a couple times, this idea that it is less about the sort of validation of the core technology as much as how you choose to use it.
Yep.
For me, it's interesting because we often talk about AI as this sort of singular thing, that it is this cluster of offerings, it is a omnibus solution. But the reality is that like AI is many, many different things. And so if you ask someone like, is there value to a vehicle? You would say, well, like, there may be value to a bike if I'm in the mountains. There may be value to a truck when I'm hauling rock. So, like, the question is there a value to AI? I would say absolutely there is in given scenarios and in given applications. I don't see a ton of value for having a chat agent, working with like approving leave requests. That seems a little too dystopian to me. Someone asks you for time off and you have to go talk to ChatGPT. But on the flip side, if you're investigating a machine that's down, or if you're investigating, data that is way, way more complicated that takes you 4 or 5 hours, I can definitely see a layer of abstraction there that makes sense. And certainly could be like an accuracy driving thing. So I think coming from that, one of the questions that I have for you all is really centered around the sort of marketing hype piece of this, because I do feel, at least for me, that a lot of the sort of negative conceptualization of AI really comes from a miss on the technical side of things of why people should care. The question is, why should I care about this? in what context? And so my question to you all is, do you think that this negative reception on the end user side and the projections of fear around, Skynet and all these things, is that because of this like broken process of marketing, or is it something a little bit more human nature centric? Like, where does that inclination to be anti-AI come from?
To kind of go into more terminology in the marketing, what it usually leans onto is right, efficiency is the term that gets thrown on. Let's be honest, what efficiency means to people. Efficiency usually means job loss, right? To make up for investment, you need to somehow kind of globally in the marketplace unlock 1 trillion dollars in value. And that's either from creating new business or eliminating expenses. Major expenses are human workers, right? I think the marketing has been very lazy in that approach because it's thrown efficiency out there with the idea that people will then determine what that efficiency like. And then they go into the easier way, which is thinking that the technology can do much. I love this idea of like approving your HR department approves your leave, right? As a dystopian metric. There's a lot of problems that can go with that, right? And so you think, oh, I can save so much in my HR department now and possibly cause more problems with it without properly understanding and educating people in the marketing that actually this is a way to extend your ability and create new business. So go on the other side of the coin, which is what we've seen in our operations of, hey, we are small, nimble, mobile, lethal. So we are a very small staff in the grand scheme of things. As a university, we do not have the $1 billion Harvard and Stanford endowment. So these tools have allowed us to really punch above our weight class and make sure that we can open up new areas of revenue that wouldn't previously, to the point that we can have projections of increasing of kind of like startup revenue projections, right? Of, increasing by magnitudes instead of, hey, we're just going to cut more and make sure that we can go down. I think that that's been the kind of biggest sin of the marketing so far, is that it hasn't really allowed people the reality that there are pathways to make it through instead of letting them live in this kind of amorphous space of efficiency of going, there's ways that you can actually increase your business expenditures, not just start eliminating people, because everything always defaults kind of to your example. Chatbot that does this, chatbot that does this, which used to be somebody's job. Like, we've been, what, 3 years? 3 years now, we've been 6 months away from all software engineers being replaced. Instead, there's probably a great argument that companies should be investing in more software engineers to open up new featureization, new revenue streams, push product faster and better that way with more engineering and some retooling and workflows. So I think that that's where we've really seen that disconnect in the marketing. Is because it hasn't allowed people to actually live in reality or pragmatic solutions and implementation.
I think it comes down to the perception from ownership or those that make decisions as I can replace workforce. As well as people don't understand where the tool can and can't do. So for example, when I say a drill, what can I do with a drill? Well, if you've used a drill before, you know what it can and can't do when you need to choose another tool. Uh, so people actually using the tools, figuring out when you start overloading the context window, when it starts to break down, when it starts to actually be like, okay, I need to restart and give it new information or frame it in a specific way to get what I want out of this thing. I can tell you I use it every day. It makes me more efficient, but it also would be lost without me at this point. So just because I've used the tools, I know what it can and can't do. I've learned how to make it integrate it into my life and make me more efficient. But as far as replacing me, uh, that's not that's not how it is today, you know.
Well, I think that's where the stories come in and matter, and the marketing is just stories. My wife has her master's in folklore and storytelling. So how does history get written? And there's many layers to this conversation. So there's a reason you want to scare people with sci-fi stories, And when I say sci-fi, I mean many different spectrum of sci-fi, from Ready Player One to Terminator, as Michael said, but to Ray Bradbury and like Octavia Butler and others. There's a pretty big spectrum of stories that we can tell here, whether it's environmental or labor. And then when you hear those stories, whether you're executive leadership, whether you're middle management, whether you're engineering, there's a lot of different stories that get told, and there's a lot of opportunity for selling people and taking advantage. And you want your workforce somewhat scared of Terminator and the level stories, because you're going to have more control from a labor perspective. And so the marketing is by design. I don't think it's broken. I think people are telling the stories that they want to influence the market in the way similar back to the sci-fi stories. And why we told those is, how we see the world and how we want to influence that world and change people's minds. And AI is just this really powerful storytelling mechanism. And I'm not talking about like generating your stories. I'm just talking about as a centerpiece. So.
And I think it's quite interesting when I think about the API space, especially because, for context, for people who aren't very familiar with this, you typically in the development of a software offering like this, you either have the product idea and then generate the API to allow people to integrate with it, which is sort of how older business worked, or you have this API first idea where you generate the API and then the product comes after it. And then all of the things that tack on to that is sort of, the first thing that comes to my mind is API discovery. There's this process of, you can discover all the APIs that you need, you can discover how they work, you can understand what the value add is. There's not much of that for AI. It's sort of like, here's the model, you figure it out. And can the model do what I need it to do? Who knows? Is it built for what I need it to do? Who knows? So I think as part of that, I think it would be helpful at this point to show some actual use cases where we feel that AI makes sense. This session seems like a big complaint about AI marketing, I'm sure. But the reality for me, at least, is that I think AI does have some really super valuable use cases. So I would like to show you all, sort of a good demonstration of that here, on FlowFuse. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of a software flow with you all, and I'll walk you through what this looks like and how it works. What this is a series of flows. On the leftmost flow, we have simulated data generation, which is basically just injecting some simulated data into a database and generating all this stuff. This is meant to simulate your factory floor. This is meant to simulate what it's like to actually have a bunch of machines that are doing a bunch of different things. Out of this, there is now this other flow. This flow is a bunch of calculations. Anyone who's ever done OE or done, like number of produced units, good units, bad units, those sort of metrics, is going to be familiar with a lot of this. What I'd like to point here is the way that FlowFuse builds out MCP, and how I think that this is actually the kind of use case that is more marketable and perhaps more applicable. So in this case, we really delineate the difference between an MCP tool and an MCP resource, which is sort of core to the concept of MCP. And we do this with separate nodes. We have two separate things here. One of them is basically just a query to a database that says, hey, I'd like to know, all of the data, basically a general select wildcard from production data with a limit. So give me all the data, which is not best practice, but is, the way I decided to build it. So you can get all of your data through one tool. And then on this other thing, you have the resources, which just lets you say, hey, I'd like to understand tolerances. Where I think this, in the MCP sense, now becomes interesting is, if you had a scenario where you were trying to understand your OEE and you're trying to understand which machines are impacting what, to me, that is actually a very good example of where AI and MCP starts making sense, because it is a time saver. It reduces this heavy load of having to ask these crazy questions. So I'll give you an example. If I wanted to ask something simple like, what machines are currently running, that's something we can all get data from, right? We can go down to the factory floor, we can see the things. This is not like, this is a useful piece of it, but it's not the end all be all. I can just come into the flow, I can look at, what's being generated. Where I think this gets more interesting is if I asked a question like, given this information, what is our current OE, and are there any machines that are artificially suppressing it? This to me is the perfect case, at least on the factory side, of AI. This is a time saver, it is a force multiplier, it is a context generator. And so when we ask the question like, does AI have value on the factory floor? This kind of question that generates this kind of answer, this could take an operator hours to do. This could be a multi-hour investigation. It could be talking to multiple people on the floor. It could be going to machines and pulling that data. And if they're old enough machines, it's not that easy to access data. Something like this only takes a couple minutes to build and a couple seconds to query. So I think this, if the question is there a good factory floor use case that sort of defies the feeling that this is just a gimmick? To me, this is that. So I think that's a really good example. I'd like to know if any of the other speakers have any other good examples they'd like to bring up.
I think for me, you know, we can connect to data and we can provide context and give tools to do that. I wanted to give people something they could do today with their toolkit they have today. And for me, that's capturing tribal knowledge. I mean, you can always connect to machines and get data and start doing some analytics around it with AI, but capturing that tribal knowledge is actually very difficult. And so a lot of you already have Microsoft or already have Google's platform. Start recording conversations for troubleshooting. Maybe you're a maintenance person. Record your conversations, take those, feed them into your AI tool that your company has purchased. Make them into a standard doc that captures your root cause of that issue, and then drop it into a shared folder and give your AI tools access to that folder, and you can start asking questions against it. This would greatly help people who are troubleshooting on the floor, and something that you guys have access likely to today. So, yeah, and it's going to take a long time to compile this information, but overall, as time goes on, it'll help you reduce your downtime, troubleshooting, spinning up new employees. I think is a huge use case that I think a ton of people are not utilizing at this point.
In our space, so I'm predominantly in the ed tech field, and so I don't know if anybody remembers their university experience, but we make it very difficult for people just once you get accepted to even start or transfer into a university through the wonders of transcripts. You have to get a paper copy, mail it, get it faxed. Digital copies are fairly unreadable. So we've built out tooling that is to basically, and so I don't know if anybody knows this. Every time a transcript comes in, it takes about 40 man hours continuously to process like with that pages of paper. So it's got to go back and forth through numerous flows. So we built a couple layers of computer vision. Um, with a generative layer on top of it that allows us to first process and scan these because a lot of them are fairly unreadable, and then match them to our catalog because catalogs might not be similar or worded similarly but have similar skills. So there's a skills ontology mapped on top of it, meaning, hey, I took this intro to programming class. It is called intro to computer science at another university. How do I match it up? Okay, this is what the skill looks like, and make sure that you get your proper credits that you paid for it at a university or coming up into the university as a freshman, however that may be. The other layer that the generative provides is really interesting for us because we can take these batches because they come at key moments, right? Every semester we get this new batch. We can batch those and then be like, hey, what skill trends are we seeing? What skill deficiencies are we seeing across these? And allow us to plan and structure our courseware and our staffing around those to make sure. It is very hard to kind of do that with human knowledge of kind of seeing the mass. Every semester we might bring in anywhere from 500 or 250 to 500 new students, depending on the semester. And so it's really hard to get those trends as a human capability. You're worried about the backfill and target. So that has leveraged us a lot of time. Our processing time now is down to just a matter of minutes where we can do that. But the important part is we've also layered in kind of human verification and appeals process. So if the student kind of doesn't understand, hey, I don't think that this sounds right, can you do it? There is kind of a ripcord to pull, which is, hey, I can now contact a human, kind of like pound and zero when you call into your bank or wherever to get to that human customer service rep. So that has become a massive time saver for us. And back to an earlier point, it hasn't changed job totals or headcount. It's just shifted what the work has been. And so instead of literally it was two people sitting and doing these transcripts every semester, though that has freed them up to now work more in our strategic intelligence area using this generative layer to help on the planning side and scheduling side, which was another part of their role. So that has become like one of our things that we're the most excited about to kind of deploy out, that we deployed out earlier this semester.
From my vantage point, I'm very focused on API governance. APIs has kind of been my jam for 15 years, but I spent a year recently standing up API governance at Bloomberg here in New York City. And when I set up those style guides, that central guidance, all the policies, how you should design your APIs, how you should develop them, I did probably 250 API reviews during that year, and God bless the 8 people who read the docs. I don't want to discount them, but nobody else read the docs and cared about what I published. And they would just show up to a design review woefully unprepared. And so injecting and guiding teams in their development environments, specifically VS Code, IntelliJ, how do you bring that governance to them and turn it into guidance? Really transforming that into, that next generation. So how can we take all your spectral rules, all your API design guidance, as well as your life cycle and documentation and mocking and testing guidance, all of that, and mock it as an MCP server, iterate on it, and then inject it into the developer workflow via Copilot, so that they have the guardrails that they need. And so that sandbox of style guides, I'm using AI to compile Adidas, Microsoft. There's a bunch of style guides out there that you can aggregate, and then iterating on it with spectral rules and other kinds of policy enforcement, using AI, using Claude specifically for that. But then, of course, using copilots to inject it into the workflow and bring it to where developers are at is a pretty key part of this, because I was always the bad guy when you had to come to me, but now that's abstracted away and I don't have to be the bad guy. So
Yeah, I find it interesting that all of these scenarios, from a factory perspective, they all have some sort of corollary or some sort of example in the factory itself as well. When you talk about, Michael, you're talking about OCR and computer vision and all these processes. There is a wealth of hand documentation out there for factory systems that eventually has to be supported. There are operational management documentation for every single machine that goes into the factory. One of the things I just recently learned, which is kind of wild, that is a little bit in my head as I'm thinking about this, is that I don't know if you all know that, but barcodes were invented in 1949. They were like almost like punch codes. They were around before the ability to scan them existed. And so like technology is this iterative thing where there's always the new technology has to go back and support the old technology. And it's just got me thinking on this process of how many factories have hand documentation, how many work orders are filled out in pen and then handed off and have to be scanned in and compared to your actual spending in your accounts payable and receivable. And like all of these processes have some corollary to what we're talking about. And it, to me, it's less about the use case, I suppose, as much as trying to make sure that you're using the technology responsibly. So I think that's the next sort of part of the conversation I'd like to move to, is making this something responsible. If we really think that there is value, if we think that this thing could be replicable, could be integratable, um, let's say we're deploying this. How do you go about making sure that the thing that we're building is not brittle? And how do we make sure that, because obviously, like I said, we're going to have to go back a year from now and support old tech while being forward thinking. How do we make sure that we're not making this sort of a continual breaking feature?
grounded in people, grounded in business processes, so whether those people are the teams who are building it or the people who are consuming whatever you're doing, grounded in what they need, talk to them, and align your whatever you're doing from an engineering perspective. Make sure there's product and business support, sales, stakeholders involved in the conversation somewhere, and do whatever you can to align whatever work you're doing with business outcomes. And like you said, just don't, how, not how are we doing this, but who and why, and and ground it that way, and resist the urgency, be thoughtful. Urgency is one way to kind of sweep you off your feet and make some of these stories more effective in getting you to do something that you probably shouldn't be. So find ways to ground things in the conversation and resist the urgency.
I like the kind of second and double tap that as well as grounding it in process becomes a really important thing, and investing in those people to go through and to kind of add parts any process, make sure that it's an iterative process, that it is being reviewed, that it is being maintained and coming through onto that. The only thing that is certain is that things will be uncertain and things are going to change. So we want to make sure that we're adjusting for that. I cannot, to Ken's point, stress the investment in human capital, and I would make sure that it spreads out, right? It is very tempting to kind of do your onboarding for a few key individuals or have that knowledge base just held in them and they maintain the document said and done. We've all heard the stories of Twitter fires the person that had the door access codes, right? So they had to call him back to let everybody back into the building. I always stress and think it's underrepresented a lot, especially as we move into these new areas of there's a problem of the bus, which means, hey, if you have somebody that holds all your kind of knowledge base, that your documentation isn't as thorough as it should be, it's not as shared out, and your human capital base isn't built to where it is. If one person steps off the curb and gets hit by a bus, how detrimental is that to your organization if that person's no longer there, right? And that can be a huge kind of spin up that needs to be undertaken, depending on what those critical systems look like and what processes they kind of own. So spread that human investment across a lot of people so that you build redundancies into that human capital as much as possible.
When we think about implementing I feel like there is a subtext that we have to sort of hang our hat on, which is in some cases it's not necessarily the OT engineer's choice to implement AI. They're being pressured to implement AI, or the business is being pressured to implement it. And so I want to inject another question into this as context. Let's assume that you have to integrate AI. That's the ask. It's the investor request. It has to happen. As we're doing that, how do we make sure from a technical point of view that we're not creating something brittle? How do we make sure that we're allowing people to leverage AI without allowing it to consume your entire process? Obviously, the human part of it is a big part of it, but how do we make sure that, A, we're evangelizing the right solution, and B, we're not melting down literally everything in the rush to do it?
I came out of Bloomberg doing the API governance thing, and I'm very resistant to this AI movement. As I said, I'm a heavy ML user, so I'm not against the technology. I'm just against what's going on right now, a lot of it. And what you opened that conversation with, that question with, was I encounter a lot of people who don't have a lot of control, and they're just trying to keep their jobs and their health insurance here in the US, unfortunately, and pay their mortgage. And so I have to sympathize with them. I had Sam Newman on my podcast a couple weeks ago. So Sam Newman of microservices fame, he's one of the people behind it. And I asked him this question, and his recommendation, which I found great and kind of in line with my subversive, is he said the storytelling works both ways. You can take your old tried and true, the work you have on the table already with the technology you already have. You can wrap it in a fake AI wrapper and sell it to your bosses that you're doing some AI agenda or some AI initiative, and color it with some stories and some things, and you're just getting your same old work done. So that's my recommendation: is stay in that safe, proven realm and tell stories, just like everyone else is.
For my answer, at least, to inject my feeling on it, I feel like this comes down a lot to making ourselves internal evangelists. That, like, you can implement it, but you have to actually decide what should be implemented, and maybe there is a lot of storytelling that has to go into that. You in effect are making your OT engineers sort of marketers for their own product.
Yeah, I think for me, if you're kind of forced to do this and go down this path, um, I would say push back and ask, what are we trying to solve? What thing are we trying to reduce? Make sure it's measurable, make sure that the thing you're trying to do is achievable. And not to mention, start small and grow from there. Start with a small proof of concept. Generally, with most integrations for anywhere analytics or whatnot in the OT side. There's generally low-hanging fruit that are very valuable, that is, very short time to value. And there's kind of pie in the sky, people just start throwing stuff at the board and it's like, what are you guys talking about? And the reason why I bring this up is uh, most OT spaces have very little documentation, as well as they're hard to communicate to and they don't have any structure. So you're going to spend a lot of time cleaning that up. And that's where, so for us at FlowFuse, is what we help do is cleaning up this data to make it available and usable to AI agents. But you're going to spend a lot of time cleaning up someone else's work that never planned for this to even happen. So just make sure you're very specific in what you're trying to do and start small.
So this is coming as a parent of four kids, and any parent will tell you this is that you have to be good at lying with your kids about a lot of things. So I can lean academically, say Plato would call them noble lies, right? They have a greater purpose. So as Ken points out, you're just trying to kind of survive. You're looking to keep your job. You're looking to keep your health insurance. Company is wanting to make sure that those investment dollars come. You need to find a way that can deliver kind of the ask, which is usually this big general ask as you laid out, right? You got to use AI. Okay. We focus and look at the processes and find it out, but you need, I love Ken bringing up this idea of storytelling, is that you need to craft this story and this narrative around it of these are the places that work, support it with the metrics and the ROI that is. And then to Drew's point, bring in the other aspects of this is why we didn't touch it. So you can kind of front run the argument of making sure that, well, why didn't we go this way? I've already covered this, right? Da 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 are the reasons why. It will help us future proof it. It helps us support the documentation. There's not enough human capital. And that kind of noble lie can lead to better conversations that are more productive holistically than just this really intense focus of the silver bullet to all our org problems is going to be we need to implement AI. That opening of the can of worms probably is the opportunity to bring light to a bunch of problems that can be solved in this conversation, or at least progress can be made on them, instead of just like, I need to get through this solution. So don't lie to your kids, folks, but lie to your kids in beneficial ways, right? So when I have to have them get flu shots, of course I tell them it doesn't hurt. It hurts, but they need to get through it to get through the pain really quickly. And so we can craft a narrative that really helps support the idea that, hey, we did accomplish this, but this is the reason we accomplished it. And then making sure these are the other areas. I think Drew's really right in pointing this out of like, we can't touch these because of these reasons, right? You might save $10,000 now, but it's going to cost us $500,000 over the next 3 years, cleaning up the mess and lost productivity and customer claims and returns, lawsuits, whatever is gonna through there. So there you go.
It really feels like there is sort of this clear. I would say that the biggest takeaway, if you have to implement something like this, is to really take a proactive and active role in what the outcome looks like. If you're in a scenario where you know AI is going to have to happen, and maybe you're resistant for good reasons, maybe you're just resistant to be resistant. The reality is like you need to be proactive in deciding what is too far, what is a good utilization, what is a use case that makes sense. Certainly don't want to connect like live user data to an AI that you have no control over how that data is going to be used. But there may be a justified reason to maybe creating an API that anonymizes that data, and then you can act upon that data. So I think taking a proactive role in that is quite important. So before we move on to the sort of the last section of this conversation and then into our Q&A, I do want to share another poll with the chat. So this is really a question specific to what just been talking about, which is what your biggest concern is when you're thinking about applying these systems. I think there are lots of legitimate concerns, especially around security and governance. That is a big question. But I would love to hear what you all in in the webinar, I think. Before we get into the Q&A, I do want to briefly talk about sort of the looking forward piece of this, right? Because this is like an edge technology. We are leaping forward every single day. It feels like there's a new model, a new massive thing. So let me ask sort of the big first and largest question that we started this with. Do you personally think that artificial intelligence, as it is right now, and this can be as small an application or as big an application as you think or as you want, do you think that artificial intelligence right now is solving real problems, or are we just adding complexity to the issue at hand?
Yes, it's solving problems and adding massive complexity and technical debt like we haven't experienced before.
100% agree.
Ditto.
Yeah, I think that's my feeling as well. I think what is really interesting, I mean, obviously, I'm a huge advocate for what FlowFuse is doing. I think that FlowFuse has a really good example of like this is a purpose-built, functionally aligned, very specific application. I'm a huge fan of the way that our expert works. On the inverse side of things, I see people doing things with AI that just don't make any sense. And I kind of want to scream from the rooftops, like, hey, this could look good. What are you doing? Please stop. And so I think that is sort of what I'm advocating for here is very much being like, in fact, this is a broader question I'd like to ask you all. I would love to see AI be treated in the same way that infrastructure is treated. You know, we don't have the fanfare anymore around cloud the way that we used to. I'd love for AI to get to that point. So I suppose my question to you three is like, what would that look like? What would success look like if industrial AI, if actual practical AI stopped being the headline marketable feature and became actual dependable infrastructure?
I would say new opportunities emerge. Big fan of reading about early days of telephone, early days of electricity, early days of radio, early days of television. They were chaotic, they were dangerous, they were exploitative. And then once they were regulated and stabilized and standardized, they became something new. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, I think for me, what I'm hoping for is kind of Jarvis for a plant, personally. I there's so much stuff, there's so much information wrapped up in tribal knowledge. So my integrator days, I spend so much time talking to operators when we would come and troubleshoot a machine, because they're the only ones that have the information about the machine, and so to have the ability to know a history of a machine, ask questions about it, know exactly why it was changed, what iterations it went through over time. To me, that's just as a someone who deals with mechanical equipment, is just massive. Um, and I have to basically assume all that information by this random data gathering, and before I make a change that could possibly hurt someone.
My big thing is plateaus are usually launch pads. So to Ken's point, there's a lot of new stuff that we don't know. What I think triggers a lot of that is when you bring off, like, you release some steam from the valve, right? There's a lot of pressure around it, kind of to the earlier question of we have to use this now because we've invested in it, because it's the new trend, because it's where when you start depressurizing things and take away those have tos, you make a better structure, right? You provide more solutions to come out. Think of if you're coaching a sports team and you're the parent of one of the players and you are requiring that kid plays every minute of the game. Even if they're a great player, they're going to get tired. There's going to be situations where they don't perform at their peak. So when we take away that restriction, that it can just be like everybody else, it allows for a lot more cohesion to come through the greater suite of just technical solutions that are out there. So once we get to that point that we can kind of go off of it, I think the trigger of that's going to be when capital flows really stop at the process that they're happening at. So when we turn off that spigot, it becomes more practical, and that will allow a lot more innovation because we'll see usage plateau, but that builds a spring pad for whatever this next wave is of it. And we've seen that happen across, like cloud's the perfect example, right? Of we saw that just become that infrastructure piece. And now there's a lot of innovation around the cloud in its solutions and its delivery and things, but it's really just in a scale story, right? And continues to kind of move through that of how can you maximize these things and how does it become more of a delivery mechanism?
Fantastic. Let's move over to Q&A because we actually have some questions coming in, and I think they're quite interesting questions. The first one here is, do we have some specific, this is from Emil, do you all have any specific examples of a business benefit coming from an AI implementation within the OT space? I actually have one that is right down the road from me. Without giving too much information about where I live, we have a water management authority out here. And in California, that is like a big deal because we don't have a ton of water. And I will say that, using automation to be able to collect all of the remote data about water table sensors and quality sensors, and then to look at that data in the abstract and compare via, open APIs, you can pull weather data in, you can pull air quality data in, you can pull environmental factors like fire data in, and then using AI to say, hey, we have a water quality issue that's been detected. Is there anything environmentally that may be impacting that? Suddenly contextualizes your data in a way that doesn't exist in any other way. Or if it does exist, you would have to build a massive dashboard for a comparative dashboard, comparative systems. I think that, for me at least, is a very good example where that sort of benefit, when you think from a pure business point of view, that means you don't have to pay 10 people mileage to go drive out to 10 different sites to collect sensor data that could just be remotely collected. You don't have to pay a bunch of people hours and hours and hours and hours to sit down instead of spending their time combing through that data and trying to figure out what the heck's going on. You could pay those people to develop new products or to develop better systems. To me, that is like a great implementation.
For me, most of the ones I've seen, they've been labeled as AI and they're really ML applications under the hood. The one example I gave for harvesting tribal knowledge, I've actually helped implement for a really good friend of mine who's a maintenance manager. And for him, we came up with the idea because he gets so many calls and we wanted to make sure his time was off. It was actually off. So we came up with the idea together and I helped him implement it.
Which really does speak to, I think, the larger point that I would make about AI is not just understanding when to use it and when not to use it, but also what it requires to use it. That, like, if you put it's a series of ifs. If you put the legwork into making your data high quality, if you contextualize the value of what you're trying to do with artificial intelligence and actually understand the difference between just like an LLM chatbot implementation versus a deep contextual sort of MCP wrapper in your implementation, and if you put effort to understanding what you're getting out of it, you can get a lot of benefit. But you have to apply those ifs. This is not like the Microsoft Clippy of OT world. You have to actually think about what it means to build the thing in. And if you do that, you can get a ton of quality out of it. Um, there's another question in here that's actually relevant to that, which is being around. So this is from Ivan. Do you think the risk of heavy dependence on large AI vendors and the associated vendor lock-in could pose a risk if applied to industry? Could greater investment in open source LLMs mitigate the problem, or do you think they will ever be competitive? I think that is actually a relevant question for this broader conversation. How do you all feel about that?
Yeah, I think in the large vendor space, there's a lot of oxygen that's been sucked up. I think that that's a stifling of really good direct solutions that are out there. We really need to kind of like scrub through and deep down to kind of get to tooling and solutions that might actually be applicable to whatever business or solution that you're looking for. There are some problems of like, increased vendorization can put more systems in play, which means that you have greater technical debt and see the cycle. But then there's the double-edged sword of you are in one of these vendors, you are really kind of trapped at what features they're going to push and what they're going to do for you. So I'm very much a prone of finding the solution that works for you. A large scale vendor, everybody defaults into an open AI. Google's very easy when it comes to LLM because it's integrated into a lot of the kind of business processes already. Cloud infrastructure is all built pretty much on AWS and Azure. So in the large vendor space, but there are so many solutions that are just below those surfaces that when you can come through, that might be more applicable to the field that you're going through. What people need to keep in mind is a lot of the large, especially LLM providers, have been really focused on power. So they continue to push it. The sub vendors makes it sound sad. The other tier, the other category is focused on implementation. So they have a solution that is really built for that sector, for that industry, for that problem, instead of, hey, we just give you something more powerful, figure it out, right? So I think there's a lot more kind of elbow grease that needs to be put around of finding the proper vendor and the proper solution for whatever problem you're trying to solve.
I think for me, this kind of this echoes the need of something in between whatever solution you're going to go with. So that way so for example, when you go with a vendor-based AI, they're going to give you a couple options. They're going to say you can install our agent on the floor to connect directly to your plant, or you can provide the data yourself to our agent. Go with the route of building that middleware and providing the data yourself into it. It's going to give you more flexibility as time goes on to replace that and pull it out and then move it into some other platform. So protecting yourself from that vendor lock-in is going to be very important and making sure that you understand the value of a middleware. And that's where Node-RED and FlowFuse can definitely help you.
Yeah. Speaking of which, this is the last question, then we'll go ahead and let everyone go. Ivan asked us, do you think that in the future Node-RED could introduce an agent-based approach like standard code development for creating flows and dashboards by providing specifications, or are current developments geared solely towards using LLM to process data? I will let you all know that actually does mostly exist right now. So if you are on Node-RED, you can use the expert that was released a little bit ago to open source. If you're on FlowFuse, we do have the FlowFuse expert, which does the same thing. If you are in your development workspace, you can ask it to help you create a flow. You can ask it to help you explain a flow. If you're not in your workspace, you can ask it how to do something, and then it'll offer to import that. You can bring it in. So this does actually exist currently, and that is something that we are iterating on pretty actively. And I think for me, that is one of the big value props of using something like FlowFuse and using something like Node-RED, as this sort of continual innovation and iterative implementation of this in a way that makes sense and is not just AI for AI's sake. Fantastic. I want to thank Drew Gotti, Ken Lane, and Michael Palmer for their time today. If you want to check out FlowFuse, head on over to flowfuse.com for more information. This has been Christopher Sandoval on behalf of FlowFuse. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Until the next deployment.